Hi, Tarik. How are you?
I'm very well, Richard. Very good to see you. Where are
Yeah,
you
hear me.
right now?
I'm at home. It's dusky here. It's the last day of good weather in Amsterdam until the downpour over the next 10 days, which is usual normal. So, welcome everybody to What's New and Hip with Tarik and Rick. In the words of Douglas Adams, Fit the second show. Yes, so we have a special guest today that we're going to probe about what's new and hip, and so maybe you would like to reveal who
We
we have.
do. We do indeed have a very special guest because I think we're going to be talking about the voice in all its glory, performed, composed for, improvised for, and the rest of it. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome a brilliant colleague and good friend, Roderick Williams, terrific baritone and what equally terrific composer, an all-round nice chap. Roderick, are you there?
Ta-da!
Oh,
Yay! Welcome,
Yeah,
welcome.
good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Good night, if necessary. Oh,
where are you?
I'm at home in Warwickshire, right in the middle of England. I live about 10 miles to the east of Stratford upon Avon, so it's all good Shakespeare country around here.
Wonderful. And what have you been up to?
I have been taking part recently in a new operatic venture put together by English National Opera. They've put on a performance of La Bohème, still obeying our UK government guidelines of social distancing. So it's a telling of the story without anybody touching each other, and it also takes place in the open air. So it's actually in a drive-in movie theatre car park. So the audience are open air, except they're all in their cars, which will be very useful, as Richard just saying about the weather turning. We're going to be performing to a chorus of windscreen wipers going, I think, over performances. And we're up on stage with the orchestra on stage behind us, elevated, and the conductor's and a cherry picker about 20 feet off the ground, so that the orchestra can see him. We can't see him because he's behind us, but that's neither here nor there. And it also explains why I've got this, what looks like a dead badger on my head here, because I'm playing this young bohemian, or not so young in my case. And so they asked me to shave the side of my hair if I would, and leave this sort of Mohican-y sort of thing going on here, which feels actually pretty terrible. Actually, every time I catch myself in the mirror,
It looks rather fine, Roderick. It's good.
well, thank you. It's not going to be a feature, and so I hope none of your listeners are tempted to come out in Mohicans in sympathy with me.
You know, these days, I think you can just palm it off as a pandemic haircut, because I mean,
Yes,
that's what everyone does. Like, I'm
definitely.
sorry, there's a dead badger on my head. It's the
Yeah,
pandemic.
I
So,
slipped awkwardly. I was having a go with myself with and the main thing is actually in 2 weeks' time I've got a photo shoot for a Schubert CD that I recorded. I know about a month or two ago, and they're desperate for the photograph of it. And I said, well, I'm not going to go on the CD like this, so we're going to have to improvise. We'll think of something.
well, it's brilliant to have you here, Roddy. So we've been talking a lot about historically informed performance, early music, new music, and how they're not as far apart as people like to say they are, and how they cross over. And I think you're actually a really brilliant guest to have for Richard and me to talk to, because you, as both, I think, you know, especially as a performer and a composer, straddle these words musically, but probably also all kinds of thinking about the way in which these two worlds meet, and presumably they meet both on the page as a composer and with your voice as a singer. But how do you feel? Is there any difference as a performer or as a composer when you approach either the contemporary world or thinking about earlier periods?
I don't think there's too much of a difference in preparing scores as a singer. Um, uh, Other than the fact the idea that a lot of contemporary, I mean, really contemporary music, hasn't been recorded yet necessarily. Things that are being written right now. So there's not a resource that you can go to in terms of listening to wonderful recordings and go back and study something. It's just a very easy way to get to know a piece is actually just to hear someone's performance of it. And if it doesn't exist, composers now are used to giving instrumentalists and singers computer-generated scores. So you just get a general idea of the kind of sound world you're playing with. And of course, it's generally speaking created by a machine, which is laughably, I mean, comically crass in most cases. Particularly, of course, with singers, because you can sample instruments and percussion and what have you, but you can't sample human voice singing words. It's what I got used to calling the singing cow. You hear whatever. It's a useful tool to be able to know where you need to pitch in terms of learning contemporary music, but it has no use other than that. So just simply in terms of the nuts and bolts of sitting down with a new score, whatever century it was written, simply the resource of having a recording is quite a game changer.
When you write, I mean, if you're like me and you've written for a whole range of ensembles, in this case, I think we're going to talk about voices and choirs. I think we've all here got some relationship with what's broadly called the sort of English choral tradition, rather horribly. And I often think about, is that in itself a sort of historically informed world? Is that way of singing that when you think about it, certainly in the UK, is one of the largest, as a body of people making music, is one of the largest commissioners of new music. It in itself also a sort of historically informed world of singing, or have we moved on from that? So I suppose when you write, especially I suppose for British choirs, maybe it's different. You, like me, have written music all over the place. When you write away, does it feel different? But the idea is, I suppose I'm wondering, can you escape the historically informed bit, or is it just a lovely thing to write for? Or is it both?
It's difficult to escape our choral background because it's hardwired in some sense. My knowledge of choral singing and composition comes from when I was 7, 8, and 9 years old and first singing as a treble in choirs. That's how I first absorbed practical music making, was standing next to the taller boy next to me who seemed to know when to come in, and I came in a quaver after him. And long before I had any idea what any of the texts, particularly the Latin texts, but not just them, meant. So I had no idea about the words that I was singing. And I was looking at music and seeing it go up and down. And I had a fairly good music theory at that age, and I was a musical geek. But nonetheless, the practicalities of being given a piece of music and saying, right, the service is in an hour, sing this. When the notes go up, you go up. When they go down, you go down. Try not to sing in the rests. Off you go. That is, as I say, hardwired in. So for me, when I write for British choirs, I think I have an assumption that they'll know how to get around the music that I write, and they will know. Also, the lower parts will be really proficient at being able to pitch harmony. Whereas sometimes in other vocal traditions, the melody is much more important, and such harmony that there is might be, it might just go in parallel, for example. Or you might have, here's another thing I worked out also, that British choirs are very good at sight reading, but they're not so good at improvising, and they're not so good at singing things from memory. And this I learnt the hard way when I started doing opera in my mid-20s and 30s, and or even song recitals, and I was having to learn things by heart. My training was as a choral sight-reading machine. And then when it came to something later on in life, for example, a different world like the pop world, for example, where you might have a session and there's not a single piece of manuscript paper in the room. This is a bit weird. And someone comes up to you, for example, and says, "Okay, we're going to do this track now. Could you just overlay something?" I'm sorry. What? Could you? Yeah, we're going to be singing here. Could you just go? Could you write that down for me, please? You know, it's such a different world, a different skill, and other countries and other genres of music have amazing things to teach us in the choral world.
Well, and Rich and I were talking last week about how improvisation seems to have been sort of knocked out of the picture from composers and performers. But I mean, what you're describing in the pop world, to me, Richard, sounds very similar to, I'd imagine, what it might have been like in the 17th century. Can you improvise?
Well, exactly. I mean, there was a whole vocabulary of improvised noodles that one learned. You studied Rognoni as an instrumentalist, but also as a singer. For early 17th century monody, there was already from 16th century a whole sort of oral tradition of ornamentation, and not just for monody, but even in we know that in 16th century polyphony there were also all the parts were very capable of adding divisions and adding ornamentation. It must have been sort of fun chaos. Somebody would have been in charge of trying to keep stuff together, or there would have been a hand being waved so that people would roughly stay in the same place. But there was a massive tradition of decorating lines. And some of that is written down. There's the whole sort of Mannerist 14th century tradition, this of hyper complicated polyphonic music, but the improvised tradition was also incredibly alive and kicking. And we think of the whole Caccini monody being a new start and something very new, and which it was, but the art of improvisation was something which would already be taken over. So that was something that carried through. The idea of basso continuo and monody was certainly new after the sort of density of polyphony that was going on. But I mean, if you want a good if you could transport Jacob Collier back into the beginning of the 17th century, I mean, just to watch him working in the studio. I mean, I don't know if you've followed his stuff, and something like the Moon River. Did you know the Moon River he did, Roddy? Have you come across?
Yes.
I mean, it is just wonderful. I mean, that's all done in his head. Yeah. He had no click tracks for that at all. However many strands there are going on, hundreds of strands going on in that video, that track. Not only is he way on top of the sort of what's going on improvisationally, but the whole thing he's sort of concerned with pitch as well, and just intonation. And he's very aware that 2/3 of the way through the track, he's gone up to A446 or A453 rather than A20. I mean, it's really wonderful, and I suspect that kind of sensitivity was probably around earlier as well. I mean, if these people were sort of jamming and improvising together, they must have had that kind of sensitivity to pitch and color. But it's fascinating. But yes.
The other thing, and the other thing that sort of is the other side of sort of sensitivity to all that is a sort of robustness, which is that, I don't know how we all feel about it, but certainly when I moved to the States and started writing more for groups out here and groups outside of the UK, and this is just my ignorance of probably having spent too much time with British choirs, not really understanding the sheer wonder and brilliance of choral music making outside of the UK, and hearing pieces of mine that had only ever sounded a particular way suddenly sound anew, and it affected the way I wrote, because I wanted to write music that was robust, that could be commissioned by a cathedral choir, an Oxbridge choir, whatever, but would end up being done perhaps by a college choir, an American college choir, let's say, that isn't so connected with this tradition, whether you want to think of it historically informed or not. And it makes me think, you know, the wonderful world we live in now, where you have music of the 17th century and 18th century, which has a robustness to it that you can almost hear two different pieces when it's performed in, you know, by different, you know, styles of what I would still call contemporary music making, whether you're trying to create it as a historically informed piece or not. They are, to me, forms of making music in the present. And so that was certainly a big journey for me as a composer. I don't know if for either of you, whether there's that sort of not sort of disparity, but sort of a bit like the universe opening. And it's funny you mentioned Jacob Collier. Like I hear he's so brilliant, and I can hear he's sort of expanding this sort of world, and it seems you can hear little wisps of sort of English choral type things, but then suddenly it's absolutely miles away, and it's to me that's lovely and brilliant and fascinating.
It's very sweet because when he was a young treble, he did a few opera performances.
He did, right? He was telling the
I
screw.
bumped into Thomas in the corridor at the BBC Maida Vale studios. He was going one way, I was going the other, and I stopped and I knew he was going to be in the. And I stopped him and said, "I'm a big fan of your work." And he said, "I'm a fan of yours." I thought, how the hell does he ever know? How do you know who I am? You know, turns out he was one of the three boys in the Magic Flute at English National Opera. We'd actually been on stage. We'd been colleagues. And the thing is, he was twice the size he was when I'd last seen him, you know. When someone comes to you and says, "You won't remember me, I was on stage with you," it's because they were probably a little treble in the past, you know. But I wanted to reminisce with another story that would give you an idea about the historically informed performance, to do with how we know so much about music of the past, not only through the treatises that Richard mentions, but also through the instruments that are left behind. And I remember once doing a concert at an auction house off Bond Street, Phillips or Sotheby's, Phillips possibly, and there were a quartet of singers there, but there was also a violinist, and the violinist was shown a case of gorgeous old violins and said, "If you want to have a go with one of these things, you could play your recital on any instrument you wish." And it was like a child in a sweet shop. This violinist was just trying these different things and just, "This is amazing. Listen to the tone on this." We singers, of course, looking at him going, "Oh, well, there is no equivalent. There is no, you know, can I try, you know, Maria Callas's vocal chords? I can't just pop it." It does. And of course, we're aware of the changes in physiology over centuries, of the basic human shape changing. We are aware of that, but nonetheless, in many ways, what you were saying, Tarik, also is that it's a continuous line of human development. So I imagine that my vocal cords are not substantially different from someone 200, 300, 400 years ago. But what I feel is different, and I've just made allusion to the recordings, is that in this century we are super aware of every piece of music that has been written that we can find since man first clunked rocks together to the stuff that we're writing, you know, been writing this afternoon. All of it is all accessible, and we've got experts who are mulling over the fine details of all of that. And I wondered to what extent a singer in an Italian court who's learning the particular skills of vocal ornamentation, be able to do that tiny filigree stuff that Monteverdi was writing. I mean, that feels to me like a lifetime's worth of study to get the style and the musculature to be able to cope with ornamentation. I wonder whether a singer of that period would have any time for the music written 50 or indeed 100 years previous to that, or whether musicians at that age were simply singing what was around them, what was being written in that time.
Yeah, I think I certainly, I mean, I'm not, I think Richard might know more about with the sort of these handshakes that happen with immediate generations. And certainly something I'm very aware of living today is that I think we're always, whether we go into a career as a musician or not, influenced by the music of our parents or our guardians, whoever, who want the music that was in the era slightly before, because that's the music that's being played around you before you have the chance to actively explore and make music yourself. So I think those sort of absolute sort of contiguous generational influences are important. But yeah, I mean, the amount of music that we have access to now is truly terrifying. I mean, it's terrifying that not only do we have access to it, but we are lost for the sheer amount of material that is out there. We need help. We need people to tell us, what to listen to. I mean, the whole idea of playlists overtaking albums are a new form of sort of curatorial experience, that there is so much stuff out there that we are reliant on ourselves and others to try and make these links for us, to form some form of cohesion. But I think certainly, I mean, as someone that writes music, I do get lost. I get lost with what's out there, and it's not in any negative way in terms of there's so much terrible music out there. It's quite the reverse. There's so much good music out there.
I think what Roddy's saying about the sort of basic physiology of the voice being the same. It's like the basic physiology of the hand. We have basically the same hands that people in the 14th and 15th century had. We have to cope with slightly different machines to how we playing on a heavy modern, which I've been doing the last few weeks, playing on a very sort of new modern pianos. And some modern pianos are wonderful to play. They're very sensitive machines. Some are not. Some are like 1930s tanks, and they're very difficult to operate. But the physiology is basically the same. And I think the filigree decoration you're talking about in early 17th century music is, in a way, it's the same kind of filigree decoration that you find in Rossini Donizetti. And certainly in the 19th century, there was a big change when things really started getting heavier and louder. There is a big sea change which happened in the 19th century in opera, really around sort of middle of the century with Verdi and Wagner. But even there, you see, I mean, Wagner, we know that his preference for voices was still basically the sort of text-based bel canto idea of what a voice was. So it's a fascinating study. But I think it's a very important point. The voice is the same. It's perhaps been abused more over the last century and a half than before. What it's been required to do by composers and compositions. But it's the same physiology, very much so. And it's the same with hands as well. I find that when having to play, Schoenberg or whatever it is, it feels very different from playing something which feels wonderful to play, like Chopin or Rachmaninoff, which are, they feel really good for you. And I'd imagine that's the same when you're singing Mozart or Puccini or Verdi. It feels good for you.
Yes, it does. It's like singing lessons, actually, handed down from previous generations. But I'm sure as a keyboard player, when you go from one instrument to another, literally one piano to another, but then from piano to a spinet, or from a spinet to an organ, a church organ or a chamber organ, the same way that a session instrumentalist will do a Baroque orchestra session in the morning, and then cross town, use the different violin for a film music session in the evening. Today's modern musician, whatever their instrument, has to know how to play in a variety of different styles, and in an instrumentalist case, on different instruments. But in a singer's case, it's the same voice, and you can treat it in a slightly different way if you're skillful. But also, you might tie yourself into fewer knots. if you learn to sing the same way, whatever the repertoire. And for me, as a bass, as opposed to a soprano, who is going to be required to sing very finely as a treble for some music, and then give it some laldy, as they say in Scotland, for the Puccini stuff. That's tricky. But certainly for me, as a baritone, I am able to use the same instrument exactly the same way for nearly all the music that I sing. And then it's a matter of taste whether I bellow a beautiful, intimate Schubert song in the same way that I would bellow a big Puccini aria or something like that,
Following on from this, in the best Here's One I Made Earlier style, Roddy, might you have something that speaks to this multiplicity and continuum, but in a compositional fashion, perhaps? I know that you've been recently working on something. Was it with the Aura singers?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
They sang something of mine at a concert recently. It was something that they commissioned a few years back. And it can do with a bit of explanation, because it's something that I've been exploring more and more. Exploring may be the wrong word. I think just making use of. And that is, you were saying, Tarik, about the range of music that's open to us, the bewildering range of music. And of course, I spend my professional life performing such a wide variety of music, and it all goes in some, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It all lodges in my brain somewhere. And of course, when I compose, it comes out in various ways, uncontrollably so. So it was that when I first started writing ever, and people heard my music, that when someone would trot up to me after a concert and say, "Oh, I did like your piece," they'd say, "It sounded very much like Britain," or "Sounded just like Copeland," or I used to sort of, I used to take them as little slaps, and then I realised, no, actually, the great thing is that the composers they mentioned were ones I admire, so that's a good start, isn't it? And secondly, I began to realise, particularly in the last 5-10 years, as I've grown older, that of course I spend so much of my time performing. It's obvious that I am going to regurgitate things I've been working so hard and intensely on, and so I've got used to the idea of being almost like a classical music sampling artist, of being upfront about saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, here is a piece that you know really well, and I'm going to mess with it like a collage artist. I'm going to look at it from a slightly different angle, or expand it in a modern sense." Now, it so happened that back in 2013, I think, something like that, Susie Digby, who conducts her choir, Aura, capital O-R-A, she came to me and with a commission to write a piece of music, expanding or thinking about a William Byrd original. It's part of a CD she put together of several composers doing exactly that. And the piece that she asked me to work on was Byrd's Ave Verum Corpus. That's great. It's a piece I know very well from being a treble, and very much enjoyed, with no idea, as I said before, no idea about what it meant, what the text meant, no idea about anything like that. I just loved the sound it made. Particularly some of the enharmonic scrunches, the false relations and stuff like that, and I just loved singing. It was a piece of music that had the hairs up on the back of my neck. So I thought, this is a gift. I'll run with this, and so I wrote this piece, Ave Verum Corpus Reimagined, and they were going to perform and record it, and I remember I happened to be changing planes in Dallas, like you do. And I happened to go online, and they sent me the first edits of their recording in some wonderful English church with a sonority, with a great acoustic. And they sent me this, and I was, as I say, my mind was on other things. I was changing planes. I was far from home. They sent me this first edit and said, "Roddy, what do you think?" And I listened to it, and honestly, the tears are streaming down my face, because it was plugging in not only to that piece, the William Byrd piece, but also to that English choral sound, Tarik, that you were talking about. It took me right back across the pond to Britain and everything that I knew. And I said to them, "Yeah, that's perfect. Keep it like that. Don't mess with it. Keep it like that." But let me play a couple of minutes of the opening of Ave Verum Corpus Reimagined, which takes the William Byrd original opening and just sort of, I don't know, you see it through a sort of 21st century prism, if you like. I'll have a listen to a couple of minutes.
That's gorgeous.
Oh, it's sublime.
You can
Wonderful.
hear, can't you, that I'm. It's funny you should say what you were saying earlier on, but Tarik, but you can hear how I'm writing for the cathedral acoustic as well. That's as much a player in that
Mm.
as the gorgeous voices of the singers in Aura. It's
I love that, and the enhanced overlaps, and it's
yeah.
you're just pulled into this. It's so interesting to think about vocal music making in those buildings over centuries, and we don't know. We don't. We do know where they were singing from, and sometimes there wasn't that acoustic, and it's a sort of there's a modern, adoration of large acoustics.
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
which is as much contemporary sensibility. But I loved it. Stunning work.
It's fabulous. It's really. It's funny. And the acoustic it is such an amazing part of this repertoire. And I remember because I was a chorister at York Minster, and just pieces like Bairstow, "Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence." If you don't know that, it's a piece by one of the great organists, composers from York Minster, Edward Bairstow, who has preceded Francis Jackson, my choir master. And that music is so embedded in that acoustic. The silences that there are in that piece are just, York Minster is part of the fabric of those compositions. And it's funny, I remember I was driving somewhere in the early 90s, and it was a Wednesday at 4:00. So it was Choral Evensong on Radio 3. And I just turned it on, and I missed the beginning, and I was just listening, and I just knew it was York, because it was just so in my bones. And that's just part of being a singer and a performer in these spaces, that you know deep inside yourself about these spaces, and it's really special, and it sounds fabulous, Roddy. It's really gorgeous.
It's
gorgeous
funny
stuff.
also to think, as in your treble days at York, that there were red letter days when you looked at what was on the sheet for the service that day, and you knew, oh, it's going to be fantastic today.
Yeah.
You know, any of the Howells canticles, you know, oh, that's going to be fantastic. And you also knew when it was, you know, some sort of
Wood in E flat number 2. Yeah.
exactly. So, oh, okay. You know, I'll drop off, and then when they wake up, it'll be the glory, and it'll all be over, you know. And you know, when there are certain pieces that just had the hairs up on the back of your neck,
Yeah.
and again, as a treble, you know, a young boy aged 8, 9, or 10, I might not have a real grasp of who William Byrd is, or Thomas Tallis, or when they lived, John Shepherd, or Kenneth Layton, or Herbert Howells, but I knew their music, and I knew which ones really, you know,
Yeah.
made me think, oh, this is going to be fun, or if, you know, if it was in 8 parts, and it was really
Yes.
rich. So you can hear also that the William Byrd, of course, is in 4 parts, but that what I wrote was in 3 choirs of 4, because I love, you know, being able to muck around with that number of voices. And what we were also saying about British choirs, you know, that only certain choirs will be able to tune those chords without thinking too much about it. And Aura, Susie Digby's choir, just sort of read it for breakfast, you know, and that's kind of where we are.
I've got. None of you know. We haven't discussed what I've brought along to play, but it fits in quite uncannily, I think, with not only your wonderful piece, but that sort of discussion. Especially, I think, as much a part of, and I know it's, you know, it's gradually changing, as much a part of that historic English tradition as the boy treble line is not just the musical value, but the attitude that you're talking about. This at very young age, the ability to turn from a piece of Ligeti to a piece of Tallis, and for it to be notes on a page to be sung. And it's very exciting. All of that sensibility and judgment that comes on up with, you know, with later in life. Like, oh God, this terrible piece of Tarik and Rick, we got to sing Tallis any day. Is later. And so I'm just going to play you one thing, very short bit, and I'm sure you'll recognise the sort of the linchpin of the work. But it's something that I think connects with the sort of discussion we've been having, and also connects with your piece in a sort of radically different way. Right, I'm going to play a couple of this. See what you think of this.
20, the last bar and the first bar, and then that first one on the last page. We always get that wrong. What do we do?
There was a bit here.
We'll get it right.
This bit here, yeah.
I'm doing it there. SB, that's me. Oh, you should be.
So I will stop that there.
I'm in a subway.
But, yes. Well, so obviously we've arrived at a performance of Sperminalium by Tallis, and that is the Salisbury Cathedral Choir that's singing it, and it's a recording from about 20 years ago. But it's not a recording, and I wonder whether you may have encountered this work. It's a work by Janet Cardiff is her name. Yeah. And it's a sound installation for 40 individual speakers, representing each of the 40 individual voices that you hear in the live performance of the Tallis. And it has become one of the important bits of contemporary art. So I've encountered this work. Very rare that I've encountered the same work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So speaking again in sort of both directions, but I've seen it in Tate Modern and in various places. But the crucial part of, well, there are two crucial parts, I suppose. One is that each individual voice is recorded for each individual speaker. So you're in a very large room, and as someone that goes to see the work, you can walk right up to each speaker, and you can hear each individual singer. But I think the most crucial part of the work is that they recorded the break when the kids are talking and the singers are talking, and it's an integral part of the experience when you go and see this work. And I've got a little recording of her talking about it because it's a different form of deconstruction that, you know, I hear, you know, totally different to what you did, Roddy, but it's that same way in from today to this earlier work. But here's Janet talking about it for about a minute or so. And I think it's quite, she's a Canadian visual artist. I like the way that she talks and doesn't use, you know, very, you know, complicated musical language, but yet she's talking very musically and very much about a lived experience with this music that is 450 years old. So let me share this again and play a minute or so of her talking about it.
I felt so comfortable once I started finally working in sound, because it was the way I wanted to work with memory, it was the way I wanted to work with narrative, and it was the way I wanted to work with the audience. When the audience member comes in, first they'll encounter a fairly dark space and they'll hear the sound of music. The music is Thomas Tallis's Speminalium. They'll see all these bare speakers around the room on simple metal stands, and they'll realize that out of each speaker comes a separate singing voice. When I first conceptualized the piece, when I first heard it on two speakers, I immediately saw it in my mind as this sculptural piece. And that's the main reason I wanted to work with it, because it was 40 different harmonies. I researched and got the score for it, and I saw the score and how it moved. Page after page, it would move like this, almost like water in a river moving around. That all became part of my idea to place it in such a way that people could experience the movement from one side to another. I wanted to sort of almost deconstruct the piece of music.
So, I mean, I just feel it's uncanny, actually, the things we've been talking about. And I think if you ever, the artwork is called the 40-part motet, a reworking of Thomas Tallis's Speminalium. But this, I think there's something so honest and so inherently musical, as someone who's clearly not a musician, coming to the work, and just that sort of innocence, and I think resonates both with the inclusion of, you know, the break in the middle of the recording with the chat, but also this idea of exactly what you were saying, Roddy, when you begin singing, things going up and down. It's a visual language, and that is you know, sculptural as she describes it. So. It feels resonant with your work in a way that is not reminiscent, but is a sort of a radical sort of way of still looking back from where we live today.
There's another tie-in for me personally as an emotional response to a piece of music like that, because, all right, this is a bit of a name drop, so get ready for this one. When I was just about to turn 50, I happened to be doing my first ever visit to Brazil. I was doing a couple of concerts in Rio and one in Belo Horizonte, as it's pronounced locally. And in between the two, there is this place. I've had to look it up as we do this. It's the Inotim, and that's probably not how it's pronounced, but the Inotim near Minas Gerais, 60 kilometers away from Belo Horizonte. It's this art museum in the middle of the forest, middle of nowhere. And our guide was saying, "Oh, we're going to take you to this art museum this afternoon, and then we'll drive on to the concert." I'm thinking, "Oh, great! What's this going to be?" And it's a huge complex, huge botanical garden with different spaces in it. And we're looking around, and with contemporary art, a lot of contemporary art, sometimes you find yourself you've been looking at the fire extinguisher for 20 minutes, and someone says, "No, that's the fire extinguisher. That's not that." So we're going through all these different exhibits, and then there was this room off by the lake somewhere, and I could hear singing. And I thought, what the hell's that? And we got closer to it. I knew exactly what that piece of music was. And we opened the doors, and I expected to see the choir there because it's so arresting to have the 40 speakers. It sounds like individuals. And not only was it the piece that just, again, has the hairs on the back of my neck, but when you got close enough to the speakers, I could recognize individual singers that I know. And this is because, this is the performing side of things. Oh my God, that's Rob M.
Yeah.
Names to protect the innocent, obviously. I know who these people are. It was just the most extraordinary thing. And it completely undid me. I wasn't expecting to have this experience in the middle of the Brazilian jungle. And suddenly I was transported to something I knew so well. And she absolutely unpicked me in that instance.
And it's amazing how it's become a phenomenon. It is one of the most widely exhibited works of contemporary art, and in a way that doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel, oh well, she's just made a recording of Speminalium and shoved it in the jungle. There's something incredibly personal and I think very, very honest about the work. But yeah, I love that story. But anyway, Richard.
Yes.
Might you?
Well, I don't think I've got anything to. I mean, I think we've covered.
We have actually
amazing amount. I'm not usually speechless, but I think it's. All these resonances and the buildings and the acoustics and the works and personalizing the works, as you say, knowing the voices. It's very pertinent. It's very pertinent to what we're doing.
I saw the. Have you ever seen the Orlando Consort do their live music? Live soundtrack to the drier Joan of Arc film from the 1920s, which I think at various points did have a soundtrack. But what they've done is gone back to create a soundtrack of 15th century music of the same era as Joan of Arc, and it's performed live with the silent movie. And it was a silent movie that always did have a live soundtrack. I mean, various people have tried to do it, but this feels very interconnected. But I feel, just thinking of what we've been talking about, and I think, Richard, you and I keep coming back with this sort of cognitive dissonance of the two worlds that we largely inhabit, that they're two places that are existing concurrently. But there was something, the performance was absolutely wonderful, and they go and, find Binchois and Dufay, these wonderful works that they perform brilliantly. But there was something about being in the auditorium, hearing this work and seeing this film, and being aware that, yes, this is a historically informed soundtrack, very much so, but this could only happen today because of the vast amount of material that we have access to, and the cognitive dissonance of being able to listen to music that Joan of Arc couldn't have listened to. She would never have had access to that music. So I just, for me, it's just that experience sums up, I feel, a lot of the things we've been talking about, these sort of, the wonderful but slightly disconcerting world that we live in, which allows us to take these brilliant journeys that we do. But it is worth remembering, I think, the sort of, in a sense, the privilege we have and of access to this stuff. So anyway, Roddy,
thank you
brilliant.
so much, Roddy. Wonderful to gas with you.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's just great. It's it's the sort of the Zoom equivalent of just meeting in a pub somewhere and sitting with a pint, going, "Hey, what about, It's great."
I've got nothing.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.